Hello, it's Robin here. Welcome to Bookspin. It's time for another book review trio. So I've got 3 science fiction books I'd like to talk about today. So let's get stuck in. The first one is called The Four-Dimensional Nightmare by J.G. Ballard. And this book came out in 1963. It's a short story collection. So I read Ballard for the first time earlier this year with The Crystal World, and I was disappointed with that one, I'm afraid. But I had heard some good things about his short fiction, so I picked this up quite recently in a second-hand bookshop. I wanted to give him another chance. And I ran a poll quite recently on this channel about which short story collection I should read next, and this one won. So this collection contains 8 short stories. It was later revised and retitled to The Voices of Time. And in that edition, they changed a couple of the stories to different ones. But in any case, this is quite a good showcase for a number of Ballard's trademark features of his writing. So we've got frequent depictions of haunting and post-apocalyptic landscapes. We've got bizarre technology, and we've got recurring themes of loneliness and isolation. I think I am in 2 minds about this book. There's no doubt that Ballard was a talented writer, a talented wordsmith, and there are definitely elements of beauty and depth on show in these stories. Some of the ideas are really compelling as well. But unfortunately, this wasn't enough for me to really enjoy them. I think all too often the stories suffer from weak characterization and, in my opinion, not very interesting plots. So they didn't quite hit the landing for me. I also found that the surrealism that he uses in his writing sometimes is a bit too disorientating and confusing for my tastes. So if we take, for example, the first story, which is called The Voices of Time, this is actually one of Ballard's most famous stories, and it's also a very celebrated story. So I may be in the minority here, but this was my least favourite in this collection. It's a very surreal story. It's really bizarre and dreamlike, to the point where the plot is almost incomprehensible, and I had no idea what was going on. There was one really interesting dystopian idea in this story which captured my attention though, and this is to do with a really strange epidemic. There's this bizarre sleeping sickness which is infecting society, which has been, it seems to have been caused by some kind of radioactive fallout. And the upshot of this disease is that every night you need to keep sleeping more and more and more. So every day you get less waking time, fewer waking hours. So the number of hours you are awake gradually reduces over time until eventually you're sleeping so much that you just end up in a coma. So I think that was quite an interesting idea. It's quite a scary idea, and it's employed in a story, but it's also combined with a lot of disparate surrealist elements that for me made for quite a confusing reading experience. And reading that story, it felt like being in a dream. The scenes just kept on shifting from one to another in a very jumbled manner, and honestly I can't really say anything more than that because I was so confused I couldn't really summarize it for you. So some of the other stories I enjoyed a bit more though, but as a whole, these stories shared a common theme for me, in that I liked some of the concepts, and I liked the world building, the dystopian landscapes, but the stories themselves just failed to engage me. So that's how it is. But there were at least a couple of stories that I did enjoy, which I think are worth mentioning. So I'm going to talk about those. So there's one story called The Sound Sweep, for example. This is a very strange story. It's got a very weird technology on show. It's set in a world in which subliminal residues of sound get absorbed into the surfaces of everyday objects like buildings and furniture and walls, and these sound residues get stuck in there for some time. And while most people can't really hear them distinctly, on some subliminal level they have an effect on people. And the protagonist in this story has an extraordinarily attuned sense of hearing, to the point where he can actually hear and listen to pieces of conversation within these sound residues that have happened in the past. So he works as a sound sweep, which means his job is to go to these objects and clean out unwanted and unpleasant sound residues using a device called a sonovac, whilst at the same time allowing pleasant or euphonious sounds to remain and accumulate. So it's a really bizarre idea, but it's intriguing, I think, and it did get me thinking for some time afterwards. So I liked that one. I also quite liked the last story, which was very thought-provoking. It's a piece of social science fiction called Chronopolis. And in Chronopolis, this is set in a world in which there's a very mysterious taboo against clocks. So in this society, it's against the law to own a clock or a watch or any kind of timepiece. And this is rigidly enforced by the time police. So it's a bit strange, because obviously clocks did exist or used to exist in this world, because you can still find them, you can still buy old clocks and watches in junk shops, but they've been destroyed effectively. The mechanisms and hands have been removed, so there is in fact no way for people, generally speaking, in this world to tell the time anymore. So people can no longer tell the time in their lives. And as you can imagine, the way the society is organized is very different to our own. And this seems very bizarre, but things start to get even more interesting when we learn how the state of affairs came to be. So in the past, there was a different regime, which was in fact a far more oppressive society, in which it's basically the opposite. Clocks and timekeeping are everything. There is a kind of repressive regimentation of the individual, which the government achieves by ridiculously strict timekeeping, and this is all controlled by the Ministry of Time. So everyone has a very strict daily timetable, which is centrally controlled by the government and stratified according to your occupation and your social class. And this is all controlled by centralized timekeeping, to the point where individual freedom is suffocated. And the clock in this society, or the previous society, came to be the ultimate symbol of oppression. So at some point a revolution took place, and the revolutionaries, when their time came, ended up destroying all of the clocks, dismantling them, and imposing a harsh ban on owning them. So that's the whole backdrop to the world in this story. So it's an excellent piece of world building, I think. And then within the story itself, we have this young man who's our protagonist. He lives in this new world in which clocks are banned, but he actually loves clocks. He falls in love with them. He has a passion in life to find clocks and make them and repair them. And as you might expect, this is going to get him into a lot of trouble. So really interesting concept, very captivating and atmospheric world building, and it's got a very neat twist at the end. So this is definitely my favourite story, the most satisfying one to read in this collection. So those are the highlights for me. It's nice to finish off the book on a positive note. However, there's not really enough within the collection for me to recommend the book as a whole. So plenty of strange and interesting ideas, but a mixed bag in terms of plot and character building. So I'm going to give The Four-Dimensional Nightmare a score of 2.5 stars. And the next book I read is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Very famous novel. So The Time Machine was H.G. Wells' first novel, first published way back in 1895. Very well-known classic, enjoyable time travel adventure. I really enjoyed this one. It's very entertaining, very easy to read, and it's got a kind of quaint feel to it that you get in a lot of Wells's stories. So this is a very famous story. I suspect a lot of the people watching this will have already read this, or at least be familiar with the basic story. But in any case, let's talk a bit about it. So in The Time Machine, we follow a Victorian scientist and inventor who is never actually named. He's just called the Time Traveller. And he goes on a very fantastical adventure. So it starts off, he's narrating his story to an audience of his contemporaries in 1895, and he claims to have travelled to the distant future using a device of his own invention, the time machine. So that's how the story starts off. We learn that he travelled to the future, the far future, in the year 802,701, in which he encounters a strange race of people who are the descendants of humanity. And these people are called the Eloi, and they are a lot smaller and less intelligent than modern humans, and they're very childlike, and they live very simple and carefree lives. And on first glance, it looks kind of like an idyllic paradise of sorts, because they have quite carefree lives, albeit it's quite a banal existence. They just sit around and they play and they eat, and that's pretty much it. But their intelligence is too limited for them to get bored, it seems, or want to do anything more with their lives. But it's not a perfect society. There's still danger and fear in this world, and this is largely due to another branch of post-humans who also live in this world, and they're called the Morlocks. So the Morlocks are very interesting. These are described as a horrific ape-like race of beings with white skin and red eyes, and they live underground because they have an aversion to light. So they live underground most of the time, and they operate these ancient machines, but they occasionally will come up to the surface during the night, and it's during the nighttime they hunt and they feed on the Eloi, who are weak and defenseless. So the Eloi are terrified of these creatures and avoid going outside after sunset at all costs. But at the same time, the Morlocks are a subservient class of sorts, because they actually produce the food and the clothing that the Eloi need to exist. So it's a very weird kind of symbiotic relationship. And in fact, this whole story is basically a fable on social inequality and class, as it's made explicitly clear when the time traveller comes to realise that the Eloi and the Morlocks are actually the descendants of the human social classes of his own time. So basically, the upper class and the working class from the Victorian era have diverged so much throughout the eons that they have evolved or devolved into completely distinct races, and they've over that time they've degenerated, and they've lost a lot of the intelligence and the strength and the humanity of their forebears. And in the case of the Morlocks, who are the descendants of the working class, this transformation is particularly grotesque. So in many ways, this is actually a dystopian story. It's a vision of the ultimate failure of humankind to resolve its social ills. It's quite a dark tale when you think about it. And in fact, it pretty much goes into sci-fi horror territory. Whenever there's a scene involving the Morlocks, they're pretty horrific people, actually. But you know, so this story has a number of levels, but you can also just simply enjoy it as an entertaining adventure story. It works in so many different ways. It's an adventure story, it's a scientific romance, it's a horror story, and it's a dystopian parable on the dangers of capitalism. But I think it's a very enjoyable read, and it's aged very well. I would give it 4 stars. I wouldn't say 5 stars because it's quite a short story. It's more of a novella than a novel, really, and I don't think it's quite as exciting as some of other Wells's stuff, like The First Man in the Moon and The War of the Worlds. But it's still very good, very entertaining. So that's The Time Machine. But before we move on to the next book, I should also say this edition is called The Time Machine and Other Stories. So it includes some of H.G. Wells' other short stories. I won't talk too much about them, but they did vary quite a bit in quality. But I would like to mention one standout story, which I think is the best story in this volume. And I enjoyed it even more than The Time Machine. And that one is called The Country of the Blind. And this is one of H.G. Wells' most famous stories, and it's a classic hidden realm tale. It's set within the context of an explorer who stumbles upon a lost and cut off civilization in an obscure valley somewhere in South America. And I do like this kind of trope. It's very reminiscent of stories like Herland, the Charlotte Perkins Gilman novel. This idea of a forgotten society that has lost contact with the rest of the world, and they've got some unique feature which makes them different from the rest of humanity. I think it's really interesting. I suppose it's kind of it's a variation of the first contact trope, I guess. But in this case, in the country of the blind, everyone who lives in the society is blind. So these people are the descendants of Spanish-speaking settlers who became isolated in the past after an earthquake cut off their valley from the surrounding landscape. And somehow or another, a mysterious disease turned everyone blind, and this affected everyone in that society and all of their descendants as well. So over time, sight is totally lost for all future generations, and the people's other senses like hearing and touch become heightened, and they become completely adapted to their environment and their living conditions. So they find a way not just to survive, but to thrive in their society without the ability to see. And many generations have passed since then, and now they have no memory of the world they left behind, and they've forgotten the concept of sight itself. So into this community enters our protagonist, who is a mountaineer who has been stranded and separated from his group. And after discovering that he's entered the fabled country of the blind, he sees an opportunity in this, and he very arrogantly assumes that he can lead these people, he can teach them, he can rule over them, because he has a unique advantage over them, because he can see. And he keeps repeating to himself the old proverb, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But in actual fact, he finds himself to be quite powerless. No one listens to him, no one understands him, no one believes him when he talks about the outside world that he comes from, and he is totally out of depth with the local beliefs and customs. Very interesting story. And like The Time Machine and a lot of H.G. Wells stories, it also serves as a social and political parable. In this case, I think on the hubris of colonialism. That's how I read it anyway. Highly recommended. But let's move on to the third book, which is Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. It's the only modern book in this trio. So yeah, this one was published in 2014, and this was quite an unusual one. The first thing that struck me when I picked this book up is I think it's got a very beautiful cover art. I really like how they use this simple turquoise colour contrasted with the white, and how the way the sea animals are incorporated into the title font. So credit to the publisher for the cover design. But in terms of the novel itself, this is basically a first contact story. It's an alien invasion story, which is obviously a fairly common theme in sci-fi, but this is no run-of-the-mill first contact story. It's basically a blend of science fiction and fantasy with mythological elements within an African setting. And specifically, it takes place within Lagos, Nigeria. And I think this is one of the main strengths for me when reading this, is how refreshing it feels to read an SFF story in another culture, a non-Western culture which I'm not at all familiar with. And there are a number of things going on in the story. There's this shape-shifting alien species who arrive beyond the stars. You've got powerful sentient sea creatures. You've got mystical elements to the story. There are figures that appear from Nigerian and West African folklore. And alongside all this sci-fi and fantasy stuff, there are quite a few interesting human characters as well. So there's quite a lot to unpack. I found the initial setup in the opening act quite engaging. It starts off with three strangers walking on the beach off the coast of Nigeria. So we've got a woman and two men, and they're all quite interesting characters in their own right. And they include a marine biologist, a soldier, and a famous Ghanaian rapper. And these three strangers' paths converge when they bear witness to the arrival of a strange alien ship in the water that triggers a powerful sonic boom. And the aliens who cause this call themselves the Elders, and they're a very intelligent and powerful race with almost godlike abilities. They have super advanced technology and abilities, and they can morph into human and animal forms at will. So their ambassador takes on the form of a human woman with the name Ayodele. And throughout the story, she's basically the only representative of the aliens that we really get to see. And she interacts with these three strangers on the beach as their first point of contact. At first, the arrival of the Elders seems to be something to be celebrated for humanity. They come in peace. That's what they say. They come in peace, and they offer the promise of new technology that will basically allow humans to move away from fossil fuels. So they come with a lot of promise, a lot of hope, but very quickly, it doesn't take long for people to screw things up. And while the three main human protagonists are all well-meaning and they want to cooperate with Ayodele, there are plenty of other characters who wish to take advantage of her to use her powers for their own agenda. Or they see her as a threat of some sort and wish to kill her. In any case, anarchy and violence quickly ensue, and the situation escalates into a major political crisis for Lagos and Nigeria, but also for the world. I did enjoy the story. It was quite unpredictable. There are quite a few memorable characters that stood out for me. So you've got Ayodele, who's the alien ambassador, and she's quite an enigmatic character. And you've got the three main human characters I've already mentioned, and they're all quite interesting in their own way. And while at first it looks like chance that brought them together, throughout the course of the narrative, there's a kind of growing sense that perhaps there's more to it than that perhaps their encounter was driven by fate. And one reason I say this is because each of these people have these extraordinary mystical abilities which they've had throughout their lives, and these are revealed and come to play quite an important role in how events unfold. And on top of these characters, there's a whole host of supporting characters, and the novel frequently shifts point of view, and this happens quite a lot, perhaps too much for some. It does feel quite chaotic to read sometimes, and occasionally you'll get a new character introduced who gets a whole POV chapter just for themselves, and then we never see them again. And then we also get some animal POV characters, like a sea animal or a spider or something like that. So it's definitely a very vivid and imaginative world that the author constructs, but it does feel a bit of a disjointed reading experience sometimes. We also get several sections in the book in which the dialogue switches to Nigerian pidgin English, and these parts can be quite difficult to understand. There's a glossary at the back of the book that explains some of the common terms that crop up, which definitely helps, but it's not spelled out for you, and I did find myself having to slow down when these bits of dialogue came up and to try and make sense of what was being said. Didn't really bother me though, because it doesn't interfere with the flow of the story too much, and I think it adds a layer of verisimilitude to the cultural setting of the story. But, you know, maybe not everyone will appreciate that. I did enjoy the ride overall though. It's very creative. It's a very mystical tale of first contact with aliens in an African society. It's as much fantastical and mythological as it is sci-fi, with a host of memorable human and non-human characters. Not my favourite first contact story ever, but I enjoyed it for what it is, and I'm going to give it a score of 3.5 stars. So, that's all for today. I probably won't be doing another book review trio for a while. I'm currently reading The Three-Body Problem, which is a reread for me. I think I first read it about 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm really enjoying that, and I may upload an individual review for that at some point. I'm rereading the whole trilogy, and these are quite chunky books, especially books 2 and 3. So I'm just going to focus on reading those 3 books for now. Perhaps reading some short stories as palate cleansers along the way. So no book spinner today, but it will be making a return in the future. I can promise you that. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon.